For nearly 2 decades, Joel Osteen has been the most recognizable face in American Christianity. His smile is on billboards, his sermons play on television screens in more than 100 countries, and his books sit on bestseller shelves next to celebrity memoirs. But behind the polish, a harder story has been building for years, one made up of financial scrutiny, public backlash, theological criticism, and now the trauma of a shooting inside his own church. Piece by piece, that story is catching up with him. Joel Osteen was born on March 5, 1963, in Houston, Texas, the fifth of 6 children. His father, John Osteen, had broken away from the Southern Baptist tradition years earlier and in 1959 opened a small congregation inside a rundown feed store with room for only a couple hundred people. That congregation became Lakewood Church, and by the time Joel was a teenager, it had already grown into a community of thousands. Unlike his siblings, Joel didn't gravitate toward the pulpit. He enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television, but left before finishing his degree. What he wanted wasn't a diploma, it was a role behind the scenes, building the broadcast side of his father's ministry. In 1982, at just 19 years old, he returned to Houston to launch Lakewood's television production operation, and for the next 17 years, he stayed almost entirely off camera. He produced, directed, and edited his father's sermons, turning a local telecast into a slick, professional broadcast. His father repeatedly invited him to preach. Joel repeatedly said no. That changed on January 17, 1999, when Joel delivered his first sermon. 6 days later, John Osteen died of a heart attack. The son who had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding the stage was suddenly the only person left to fill it. What followed was one of the fastest expansions in the history of American megachurches. Weekly attendance, which stood around 8,000 when Joel took over, climbed past 25,000 within 5 years. Osteen doubled the church's television budget, bought better time slots in major markets, and leaned into a message that skipped past hellfire and judgment in favor of encouragement, hope, and personal success. In 2003, Lakewood struck a deal with the city of Houston to lease the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets, a 16,000-seat arena. The lease ran for decades, and the renovation to convert a basketball stadium into a sanctuary cost tens of millions of dollars. When the doors opened in July 2005, every seat was filled, and millions more watched from home. Weekly attendance eventually crossed 40,000, and Lakewood's broadcasts reached an estimated audience of many millions across the globe, making it arguably the most-watched ministry on television. Then came the book. Your Best Life Now, released in 2004, was expected to be a modest success for a first-time author. Instead, it became a phenomenon, spending years on bestseller lists and selling millions of copies worldwide. It cemented Osteen's brand, faith mixed with self-help, delivered in a warm, non-confrontational tone that appealed as much to people who never opened a Bible as it did to lifelong churchgoers. Osteen didn't build this ministry alone. He met his wife, Victoria, at a Houston jewelry store in the mid-1980s, and the two married in 1987, years before Joel ever stepped into the pulpit. Victoria's background blended faith and science in an unusual way. Her father was an engineer who had worked on NASA's Saturn rocket program, while her mother taught Sunday school. After Joel took over Lakewood, Victoria became far more than a supporting figure. She launched the church's women's ministry, became a co-pastor in her own right, and built a publishing career of her own, with her first book debuting near the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Their 2 children, Jonathan and Alexandra, grew up almost literally on stage. Both were performing in front of tens of thousands of people at Lakewood's touring events while still in their teens, and both eventually stepped into ministry roles of their own, Jonathan leading worship and eventually preaching, Alexandra becoming a lead vocalist for the church's music ministry. In many ways, Lakewood isn't just Joel Osteen's ministry. It's a family enterprise built across 3 generations, from John Osteen's feed store congregation to his grandchildren's music careers. That family branding extended into a genuine media and publishing empire. Osteen has written more than a dozen books, several of them New York Times bestsellers, and has built a business around speaking engagements, arena tours, and merchandise sold both online and through Lakewood's gift shop. His social media following runs into the tens of millions across platforms. In 2013, he took his ministry on the road with a touring series of stadium events, selling tickets for what were essentially motivational faith concerts, complete with music, lighting, and production values closer to a touring artist than a traditional revival. The events routinely sold out major arenas in cities across the country and eventually overseas, including a sold-out show at London's Wembley Arena. It's a genuinely impressive business operation. It's also exactly the kind of operation that invites the question critics keep asking. Is this primarily a ministry or primarily a brand? That same formula that made Osteen famous also made him a lightning rod. His ministry is closely associated with the prosperity gospel, the idea that strong enough faith, right words, and trust in God translate into health, wealth, and success. Critics inside and outside Christianity have pushed back hard on this framing for years. Theologians have accused Osteen of preaching a version of faith that skips over sin, repentance, and sacrifice in favor of feel-good affirmations, calling it theology without a cross. Supporters counter that his message of encouragement has reached people that traditional churches never could. The criticism intensified because of how visible Osteen's own success is. Public estimates have placed his net worth anywhere between $50 and $100 million, built largely through book royalties and speaking engagements rather than a Lakewood salary. Osteen and his wife have said publicly that they haven't drawn a paycheck from a church since 2004. Still, the optics of a pastor preaching abundance while living in a multimillion-dollar Houston home have never fully gone away, especially when set against a ministry budget where the overwhelming majority of spending goes toward media production and weekly services rather than charitable outreach. If there's a single moment that crystallized public skepticism toward Osteen, it's Hurricane Harvey in August 2017. As floodwaters swallowed Houston and thousands of residents searched for shelter, Lakewood's massive arena initially remained closed, with the church saying the building was inaccessible due to flooding. Photos and videos quickly circulated showing dry streets around the church, and the backlash was swift and loud, spreading online under hashtags demanding the doors be opened. Under mounting pressure, Lakewood did open its facility to evacuees, but the delay left a mark that has followed Osteen ever since, resurfacing every time a storm hits Texas, and people ask, only half joking, whether Lakewood will open its doors this time. That reputation took another hit in 2020. As COVID-19 shutdowns emptied church pews and drained donation income, Lakewood applied for and received roughly $4.4 million in federal Paycheck Protection Program funds, money designed to help small businesses keep employees on payroll during the pandemic. The loan covered salaries and benefits for hundreds of Lakewood staff, and church representatives said none of the money benefited Joel or Victoria Osteen personally. But given Lakewood's roughly $90 million annual budget and Osteen's personal wealth, the optics were brutal. Critics, including church-state separation advocates, argued that a ministry of Lakewood's size and resources shouldn't be drawing on funds meant for struggling small businesses. Facing sustained criticism, Lakewood announced in late 2021 that it would repay the loan in full. Financial disclosures and reporting over the years have shown a consistent pattern at Lakewood. The vast majority of spending goes toward keeping the media machine running, television production, weekly services, staffing, and events, while a comparatively small slice goes toward missions and direct charitable outreach. Because churches in the United States aren't required to file the same public financial disclosures as other nonprofits with the IRS, outside observers have had to piece together Lakewood's finances largely from what the church chooses to share or from investigative reporting. That lack of mandatory transparency isn't unique to Osteen. It applies to mega churches broadly, but Lakewood's scale means the numbers involved are larger and the scrutiny sharper than almost anywhere else in American religious broadcasting. This is where a lot of the skepticism toward Osteen really lives. It's not that people doubt Lakewood is a real, functioning church with a real congregation. It obviously is. It's that the same exemption from routine financial disclosure that protects small, struggling congregations from burdensome paperwork also shields an operation with a budget in the tens of millions of dollars and a media reach in the hundreds of millions. Watchdog groups that track religious nonprofit spending have repeatedly pointed to Lakewood as an example of exactly why that exemption deserves more scrutiny, not less. When a ministry's own numbers show media production and weekly operations dwarfing direct charitable giving, and the public has to rely on leaks, tax filings connected to unrelated programs, or the occasional voluntary disclosure to even see those numbers, the where does the money actually go question doesn't have an easy answer. And that ambiguity has become one of the most durable criticisms of Osteen's ministry, resurfacing every time a new controversy puts his finances back in the headlines. Then, in February 2024, tragedy struck in a way no amount of criticism about finances or theology could have anticipated. On February 11th, a 36-year-old woman named Janesse Yvonne Moreno walked into Lakewood Church carrying a rifle, accompanied by her 7-year-old son, Samuel. Just before a Spanish-language service was set to begin, she opened fire in a hallway, wounding a bystander before being shot and killed by off-duty officers working security at the church. In the chaos, Samuel was struck in the head. What followed was one of the most harrowing storylines connected to Lakewood in its history. Samuel underwent multiple emergency surgeries, including procedures to remove portions of his skull, and spent weeks in critical condition before doctors were able to take him off a ventilator. His grandmother, Rabbi Wally Carranza, shared updates throughout his recovery, describing a boy whose life had been permanently altered by injuries no child should ever have to survive. The investigation that followed raised uncomfortable questions that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with safety and oversight. Moreno had a documented history of mental illness and a criminal record. Investigators found anti-Semitic writings in her background, and reporting indicated a long-running family and custody dispute may have factored into the attack. Despite all of this, she had legally purchased the rifle just months before the shooting. A year later, in February 2025, Houston police closed out their investigation and handed the case to the Harris County District Attorney's Office, where a grand jury was tasked with reviewing how officers responded and whether any additional findings would follow. For a church with tens of thousands of weekly attendees and a security apparatus built to match, the fact that an armed individual could breach an entrance and open fire before being stopped raised hard questions Lakewood has had to sit with in the years since. Osteen addressed the congregation in the aftermath, offering messages of faith and resilience and extending prayers even for the shooter. Some in the congregation found comfort in that response. Others, including advocates pushing for stronger gun laws, felt it sidestepped the harder conversation about how a person with a documented history of mental illness and violence was able to walk in with a weapon in the first place. The uncomfortable truth is that Lakewood is exactly the kind of soft target that safety experts have warned about for years, a building that welcomes tens of thousands of strangers a week, with entrances designed for ease of access rather than airport-level screening. Reporting after the shooting revealed that people close to Moreno, including former in-laws, had raised concerns about her behavior well before that Sunday, and that she was able to purchase her rifle legally only a couple of months earlier, since Texas has no red flag law that would have allowed courts to intervene given her documented mental health history. None of that is a criticism unique to Osteen or Lakewood. It's a broader story about gaps in the American system for flagging dangerous individuals before they act. But it landed on his church, in his sanctuary, in front of his congregation, and it's now permanently part of the story people tell about Lakewood, alongside the billboards and the bestsellers. Beyond any single controversy, Osteen's ministry is up against a broader demographic shift. Survey after survey has shown church attendance among younger Americans falling to historic lows, with only a small share of millennials and an even smaller share of Gen Z reporting regular attendance. That's the exact audience Osteen's made-for-television, motivational style was built to reach 2 decades ago, and yet the pattern isn't holding for churches broadly the way it once did, as younger generations increasingly say they're looking for community and authenticity over polished production. Interestingly, some recent reporting in 2026 has pointed the other way for Lakewood specifically, with the church highlighting renewed interest among younger congregants returning to faith. Whether that reflects a genuine reversal or simply Lakewood's talent for controlling its own narrative is something outside observers will likely keep debating, because that tension between the story Osteen's ministry tells about itself and the story that outside reporting tells is really the through line of his entire career. A pastor who built an empire on hope and positivity now has to answer for a hurricane response that didn't match his stature, a pandemic-era loan that didn't match his church's resources, and a shooting that exposed how fragile safety can be even inside a 16,000-seat sanctuary with a name like Lakewood. None of this has toppled Osteen. His broadcasts still reach a global audience. His books still sell. Lakewood Sunday services still fill thousands of seats. But the goodwill that carried him through the early 2000s has been chipped away year after year, by a hurricane, by a loan, by financial disclosures that don't match the message of abundance, and now by a tragedy that put a 7-year-old boy in intensive care inside the building Osteen spent his whole life building up. For a ministry whose entire brand is built on hope and momentum, that's the real problem. It's not any single scandal. It's the accumulation of them, each one a little harder to spin away than the last, each one chipping at the idea that the smile on the billboard tells the whole story. There's also something notable about the timing of it all. Osteen built his entire public identity around the idea that things are always about to get better, that faith and positivity carry you through whatever comes next. That message worked beautifully during the ministry's rise, when the story was one of unbroken growth, a feed store turning into a basketball arena, turning into the biggest single congregation in America. It's a much harder message to sustain when the headlines are about a hurricane response that embarrassed the church, a federal loan the church had to give back under pressure, and a shooting that left a child fighting for his life in the same hallway families walk through every Sunday. Whether Lakewood's recent talk of a youth revival is the start of a genuine turnaround, or just the latest chapter in a ministry that has always known how to manage its own image, is something only time, and a lot more scrutiny, will answer. What's clear is that the version of Joel Osteen the public met in the early 2000s, the relentlessly upbeat pastor whose only real controversy was being too positive, doesn't exist anymore. In his place is a much more complicated figure, still enormously successful, still enormously watched, but trailed now by a set of questions about money, safety, and accountability that no amount of stagecraft has fully managed to answer.